Every time I visit Beijing, I always have a great time. I feel a strong connection with the Sanji Academy and with all of you, and I've made many friends. Today, I'm excited to meet some new friends, which is always a happy thing. Being part of a forum like the Sanji Academy is a fantastic opportunity. Yesterday morning, I talked about the topic, looking at Western modern philosophy through the lens of Songming Neo-Confucianism. I brought up this topic to discuss a really important issue: can contemporary China uphold the principle of subjectivity? This question directly impacts the spiritual bedrock of our Chinese society and our collective sense of identity. It raises the profound inquiry of whether we can genuinely accomplish the mission of modern enlightenment. Will there come a day when our streets are adorned with wise individuals, embodying the vision articulated by Wang Yongming, 16th century? Ultimately, it calls for the realization that each and every Chinese person can become an autonomous and morally upright individual. Wang Yongming, our great philosopher from the Ming dynasty, once said that every Chinese person, no matter who they are, should aim to be a hero in controlling their own spiritual path. This quote shows that the Chinese themselves kick-started the movement of Songming Neo-Confucianism as a way to enlighten themselves. If we can reach this enlightenment goal, China might have stepped into modern society even before Europe. The reality, though, is that European nations were the first to embrace modern society, not because of superior technology but because of their modern mindset. Even today, this topic is still relevant in China. Many Chinese cities like Beijing and Shanghai are really modern these days. Our material way of life is pretty advanced too. We've even overtaken Japan to become the world's second largest economy. It's something to be proud of, but at the core, we still haven't fully embraced modern society. That's why I wanted to bring up this topic yesterday. So, how should we approach this? Yesterday, I came to the conclusion that in China, you can't really rely on reason alone, you need to tap into the spiritual side of things. But, let's face it, that's a pretty big idea to unpack in just one quick lecture. Today, we have a chance to dive deep into the origins and essence of Western thought before circling back to see where China fits into the picture. We don't even know who we are. It's like we're stuck on the misty Lu Mountains. We don't see the real Mount Lu because we're too caught up in being on this mountain. When we think we're looking at the West, we've actually been looking at it for ages because we've been reading Western stuff since we were young and getting into Western science bit by bit. Back in elementary school, we start with basic common sense, which is actually all Western science in disguise. Then in middle and high school, we dive deep into Western science. Since science comes from philosophy, so without even realizing it, as we learn about Western science, we're actually soaking up Western ideas too, we're just not aware of it. Today, let's dig into what kind of thinking paved the way for Western natural science to thrive. Our focus today is on the deep thoughts of Western philosophy. We can't cram 2 semesters of philosophy into one day, let alone the whole history of Western philosophy. So, let's stick to exploring the philosophical realm of the West. I've got 7 questions lined up for discussion, but we might not get through them all if time flies by. The first question on the table is about where Western wisdom began, with the Greeks pondering language and existence. Here's the scoop: human wisdom doesn't come in just 1 or even 5 flavors. There are actually 4 main types that all popped up around the same time. We're talking about the 5th century BCE. Back in the day, during the 5th century BCE, 4 major nations made a big splash by providing some top-notch prophets and philosophers for the world. China was in the mix, producing Confucius and Laozi during the pre-Qin era around 5th century BCE. Over in ancient Greece, Socrates and Plato were doing their thing in shaping human thought. Meanwhile, ancient India was also on fire, giving the world Gautama Buddha in the 5th century BCE. Let's not forget ancient Israel, who had their own crew of early prophets laying down the foundation for Western Jewish thought. This epic era in the 5th century BCE even got its own catchy title. They call it the Axial Age. The Axial Age is like a big marker in human history. Way back before that time, we had civilizations popping up all over the place. Think Babylonian, Assyrian, ancient Egyptian, you name it. They'd rise, do their thing, and eventually fade away into history. But once the Axial Age hit, humans started getting all philosophical and wise. Turns out, after tapping into different kinds of thoughts and wisdom, we learned that when a major civilization hits a rough patch and can't figure a way out, it ends up circling back to the Axial Age vibes. By reconnecting with ancient thoughts and wisdom, these civilizations manage to find their path forward. It's a pretty cool pattern, right? So, here's the deal: old ideas stick around, wisdom is all about the ancient stuff, and anything new gets labeled as the hot new trend. If someone comes up to me all serious one day and says, "Hey, Wang Defeng, I had this brand new idea last night," I'd be like, "Seriously?" And if they insist that it's true, I'd have to chuckle and ask, "How on earth did you come up with a new idea? Maybe it's just a new thought." I mean, let's face it, ideas are always recycled, and true wisdom can be found in the past. As for that fancy philosophical book by yours truly, Wang Defeng, don't bother reading it. It's just a bunch of words to fulfill my job requirements and impress the higher-ups. It's a long read, in the tens of thousands of words. Now, think about Laozi's Tao Te Ching, it's only 5,000 words. My philosophical essay, on the other hand, is way longer than that, but honestly, it's pretty pointless. I know only 2 people will bother giving it a glance, myself and the editor. Once it's out there, it'll get filed away, and come year-end, I'll be judged on how many of these academic pieces I've churned out. Just imagine, Laozi's Tao Te Ching has been analyzed and explained by Chinese thinkers for ages. There's already a ton of works delving into the Tao Te Ching, and more are sure to come. So, when we talk about a nation's ideology, we gotta go back to where it all began, to the roots of their thoughts, to truly grasp what makes up their ideology, wisdom, and essence. That's why today, let's kick things off with the ancient Greek ideas about language and existence. Philosophy didn't kick off until after religion was already a thing. When I say religion, I'm talking about the old school kind. We've all heard about the crazy myths from ancient Greece that tell us about how the gods all got along. Supposedly, these gods chilled up on Mount Olympus, and the big boss was Zeus. Back in the day, each Greek city had its very own protector god, like Athena for Athens. That's basically what the OG religion of Europe was all about. Finally, this dude named Thales showed up. He didn't leave behind much of what he said, but we do know one thing he said for sure: water is the key to everything. He believed that water was the root of all things, the source that unified everything in the world. Because of this one statement, Western philosophy got its start. It all began with folks trying to figure out the origins of the universe, a field known as cosmology. Thales ended up being called the father of Western philosophy. It may sound silly to us now: how can water be the basis of everything? Water itself can be broken down further: it's just H2O, made up of 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom. It's not the be-all and end-all. Today, we think it's pretty weird. What kind of talk is that? But when it comes to the beginnings of Western thought, this sentence is super important: it's like the foundation of everything. Why is that? Well, it's because instead of explaining how the world began and why everything is the way it is using our imaginations and making things up, this sentence points to a more basic truth. In the past, people used imaginary stories and gods to make sense of it, but now we have to rely on human knowledge and ditch all that imaginative stuff to grasp the true foundation of this world. So, this sentence carries a lot of weight. It means two things. Firstly, it tells us to look to nature itself to understand nature. In the old days, folks didn't do that. They believed in some higher powers to explain things. That was like primitive religion. Now, we've learned that the key is to stick to what we can see in nature to make sense of it all. This approach paves the way for reason to guide us. This sentence holds the principle of reason within it. We're moving away from imagination and leaning towards reason. Understanding nature by observing nature requires reason, not just wild fantasies. In this statement, it's like saying water is the boss of everything, but it also means something else. Even though things in the world are all different and always changing, they all come together as one, united in water. It's like a blending of all the different stuff in the world, making it all one big unified thing. When we get into philosophy later on, us Chinese folks in school study Marxist philosophy, and the first chapter goes on about how everything in the world is connected through materialism, which is basically the backbone of the world's unity. So, because Thales said that, he's known as the dad of Western philosophy, and that's how Western philosophy all got kicked off. The first thing it focused on was how the world began. Every group of people has had a phase of basic religion, even us Chinese folks. We had all sorts of gods we used to think about. We had a bunch of them, like the god of money, the god of cooking, even door gods, and a bunch more. All that stuff falls under basic religion. But not every crew goes from basic religion to getting deep into philosophy. The Greeks took the road to philosophy, and down the line, the Chinese hopped on that train too, and let's not forget the Indians and their ancient philosophy. When it comes to philosophy, the whole world's philosophy is split into three main groups: European philosophy, Chinese philosophy, and Indian philosophy. Indian philosophy has kind of faded, so now when we talk philosophy, it's mostly about Chinese or Western philosophy, with Western philosophy having evolved from ancient Greece. This led to the talk between Chinese and Western cultures, the chat between Chinese and Western thoughts, turning into a discussion between Chinese and Western philosophy. After Thales, the idea of how the universe started kept evolving. His student, Anaximander, thought that water was too specific and just didn't fit as the basic building block of everything. He realized that some things are totally dry, so calling water the source of all things didn't quite add up. That's why Anaximander changed his teacher's theory and suggested a new idea, that the infinite is what kickstarted it all. What does the term, the infinite, mean? It's basically the original messy and all over the place stuff, which is what Anaximander called the infinite. He thought there wasn't one specific thing you could pin down, so he came up with this idea. Then there's his student Anaximenes in the mix. It goes like this: you've got the OG Thales, then Anaximander, and then Anaximenes. Anaximenes wasn't buying into his teacher's spiel and started asking about where the world and the universe really began. You can't just toss around the term, the infinite, like it's no big deal. You need something concrete to serve as the starting point. So Anaximenes tweaked his teacher's theory, setting straight what Anaximander had put out there. He went with the idea that air is what everything boils down to. It's kind of like tapping into that Chinese mindset with the whole yin and yang, 5 elements vibe, somewhat in sync with Chinese thinking and their take on yin and yang and the 5 elements, but not exactly the same. In simpler terms, what Anaximenes called air is basically a universal go-between. His idea of this air thing paved the way for the whole ether concept in physics. You need this medium for stuff to interact and connect with each other. It's like Anaximenes' air concept is the glue that holds everything together as one big unit. Later on, in the world of physics, they started talking about something called ether. But hey, that idea got tossed out the window by modern physics. So, what was this ether thing supposed to explain? It was all about action happening from far away. Ever wondered how Einstein, when he was just a cool 10-year-old, got all worked up over a compass? Picture this: a friend of his dad brings over this toy, a compass, and young Einstein is like, "Whoa, hold up, why is this needle always pointing in the same direction no matter how I wiggle around?" He's scratching his head, thinking, if there was a tiny string pulling it, fair enough. But seriously, where's the string at? The needle just keeps on doing its thing without any visible force nudging it. And there goes 10-year-old Einstein, diving headfirst into this mystery. There's something invisible at play, making that compass needle stay put, always pointing north. He's mulling over the idea of action happening from a distance. It's like when you push a cart and it moves, then you stop and it halts. We've all felt that before. But what's the deal with the compass needle? There must be some sneaky force at work, hiding from our eyes. The puzzle that had young Einstein's brain buzzing is what later physics labeled as the whole ether concept. The reason why action can happen from a distance is because of this thing called ether, which basically helps get the job done. So, when we're talking about how fast light can zoom around, it's like the speed champ in the whole universe, top dog. Even if something tries to outpace light, it'll still have a speed, right? And when it's cruising along, it's covering some ground in a jiffy. That's what we call the speed of light. But what's the big deal about having speed, you ask? Well, it's like this: when you see light zipping along, it's encountering a bit of resistance on its journey. If there were zero obstacles in its way, we wouldn't even talk about speed. That's where the idea of ether in physics comes into play. It helps explain this whole scenario. So, Anaximenes had some deep thoughts that were a big deal too. He used the concept of air to make sense of how everything in the world fits together, showing how things interact universally using air as an example. You know, it's kinda like how the ancient Chinese thought about yin-yang and the five elements theory revolving around air, but not exactly the same vibe.